started then. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, to this episode of Truth Warrior. I'm your host, David Whitehead, and I'm working, obviously, on this as well in tandem with Modern Knowledge. Our website is modernknowledge.ca. So hello to all those that recently attended our event across Canada. And we're working hard behind the scenes to bring you the cutting edge of alternative thought, alternative research, taking a look at the past, taking a look at our history and our origins, and trying to dig up a lot of things that haven't really been discussed in the mainstream so that you, the listener, can take it in for yourselves and do your own research, and we can kind of peel back the layers and discover the truth about who we are, where we come from, and where we're going. And I want to welcome my two guests today. We have Ralph Ellis joining us and also Michael Tessarian. And I just want to say about both these gentlemen that both of them have profoundly impacted my life and my research and my train of thought. I've had the honor of working with both of them, and I think that their message and their valuable work is very, very key at this time, as we're discovering new information constantly. And without people like this who are questioning the status quo, who are looking at things in a different way, we really wouldn't have a good grasp on where we are, because we'd be getting it only from one source. So I just want to say to both of you that I have a great deal of respect for your work, a great deal of respect for you also as individuals, and it's an absolute honor to be here with you on the show today.
Good morning, and yes, it's great to be with you, and to Michael as well, who's miles away over in Northern Europe somewhere. I'm down in Southern Europe, so we're spread across the world this morning, but it's good to be here.
Nice to be with you all, and Ralph, great to be having, well, I feel proud to even be part of this, to celebrate this feat, this master feat that is going to go down in history. I think of this as a tremendous historical moment. My hands have been shaking to read the book actually since, you even first told me about it a year ago, that you were working on this after reading Mary Magdalene and Jesus of Edessa and, of course, the masterpiece King Jesus. I mean, I was reading that on the ferry between Seattle and Vancouver, and, I didn't even see the scenery because I was so absorbed in the book and just amazed because of the whole thing with Saul Josephus. And then I thought, okay, this is his 7th or 9th book. I mean, you can correct me on that in a minute, but it's certainly going to be the final word, because to me, it just, once you close that book, it was like, there's nothing more to be said. And then when we talked after that, you indicated that there was, Mary was on the way, Mary Magdalene, and then even this one. It was just, I couldn't believe it. I said, how can one man do this? And also, I want to punctuate what I'm saying here by the fact that I want to tell the audience who's not familiar with your work that you actually are kind of an Indiana Jones. You actually do go out into the field. You spend time and money going to Syria, to Palmyra, and to in Palestine and these other places. You don't do it from the armchair. You don't do it just sitting in front of the computer. You are actually in the field, looking physically. Even you've been to Ireland for one of your books, I think Scota. In that book on Queen Scota, you actually came to Ireland and went to Newgrange. And you are one of the few people who actually do that, take the time to actually go and look at that. Then you went to Cheshire, your maps and your reading of Cheshire, where Jesus, of Gamala was interned. You've actually been there and looked at that area in ways that no one living has even looked at, or commissioned maps and analyzed them in ways that no other human being has done. So this work, like the others in the series, 3 specifically, but then a lot of other books before that, is a tremendous in the field research as well, which is second to none. So again, congratulations on the release of this book. And for those who are not familiar with Ralph's work, this is just a way for me and David to celebrate, Ralph's life, his career, his work, and this latest book, and also to get you to realize how monumental, as David was saying in his introduction, the lids are coming off, the covers are coming off, the veils are being removed. There's so much here, and this book is going to really, stretch out into history and be read, I think, by a lot of people, and it's going to, raise a lot of eyebrows for a long time. I wish all of Ralph's work would do that, but this one I think is going to have that extra apostrophe attached to it because of the depth of what he's been doing and the grandeur and size of the Arthurian legend anyway. So again, great to be here and be part of this interview. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for your kind words there, Michael. It's very nice to hear sometimes that your work is appreciated, because it is a lot of work. It is a lot of work, and yeah, this is part of the King Jesus trilogy, I say. So this started with Cleopatra to Christ, which was linking the life of Jesus with the Egyptian record, and then it went on to King Jesus, which was quite pivotal in a way. That was linking initially Saul with Josephus, which I'd done that back in 1998 or 97, but it needed further work to prove it because no one would believe it, and that's pivotal because it changed the story. It changed the biblical story from an AD 30s story to an AD 70s story about the Jewish revolt. And then that went on to Jesus, King of Edessa, which actually found Jesus within the historical record as a king of Edessa, which is in northern Syria. That's when I went off to Palmyra and places like that, which is just as well actually probably I did, because it's gone now, of course. It's all been destroyed, all of it, all of the Temple of Bel, all of the tower tombs and so on. They've all gone now, courtesy of ISIS. So yes, it was just as well I got in there at that time and was able to do the research before it was all destroyed. So that was the King Jesus trilogy, and that was a standalone trilogy about the historical Jesus. And then during that research, I started coming across little bits of Arthurian history, which started impinging upon the work I was doing. And at the time, I knew nothing about Arthurian history. It really was a different subject completely. But it was pointing towards some of this Arthurian history being linked to the story I was already looking at. So this new book I've written, which is called The Grail Cipher, is really a part of the King Jesus trilogy. So it's become a trilogy in 4 parts, which I think that was Douglas Adams said that, wasn't it? A long time ago. So yeah, it's now a trilogy in 4 parts because it's part of the same story. And I had no idea it was going to be like this. I don't plan any of these books. They just sort of happen. I follow the evidence and I head off in whatever direction it's going in. And it's sort of ruffled a few feathers because a lot of traditionalists don't want to lose the British King Arthur character because it's he's become a part of British heritage, British history, even though he doesn't exist in the historical record. And so there's been a little bit of opposition to this particular story. But I think it's going to catch on because while it changes British history, it also links British history and European history and biblical history all into one big story from, 2,000 years ago. All a part of the same Roman Empire story. Obviously, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain all the way down to Judea, and it was all part of the same story, because Jesus, in the end, ended up in Britain, as we've probably talked about before in one of the other parts of my series. And this is where it all sort of links in together. So perhaps we should start with some of the first aspects of Arthurian history, because Arthurian history is not taught very well as a subject. So the real King Arthur was supposed to be a Dark Age king. He was supposed to be from the 5th century, late 5th century, maybe early 6th century, within the Dark Ages in Britain and within Brittany, which is called Amorca, funnily enough, Amorica. And the strange thing is he does not exist in the historical record. So all of these wonderful stories we have, especially the television programs and the Hollywood films about King Arthur, that King Arthur does not exist. Because they tend to they tend to show him as being a medieval king when he wasn't. He was a Dark Age king. So if he was a king, he would have been dressed in Roman armor, not in the armor of the sort of Middle Ages. But he doesn't exist. So if we look at the beginning of Arthurian history, the early records, we have chroniclers like Gildas. He never mentions Arthur. The Venerable Bede, 8th century. He never mentions King Arthur. So the very chroniclers who were there at the time, at the end of the Dark Ages, never mention King Arthur. The other well-known chronicler at that time is Nennius. That's from the 9th century. And even Nennius doesn't mention King Arthur. He mentions a warrior called Arthur, but there is no King Arthur, there is no Guinevere, there is no Lancelot, Galahad, Camelot. Any of these familiar items from Arthurian history just simply don't exist. And they don't exist all the way up until the 12th century, early 12th century, when we get a character called Geoffrey of Monmouth, who then writes the whole of Arthurian history. And so there is a problem with Arthurian history. We have this great lacuna, we have this enormous historical chasm of 600 years between the Dark Ages and the 12th century, when there is no King Arthur. And then suddenly he arrives in the 12th century. And the one or two references we have to the early King Arthur, I think, they don't mention King Arthur, they mention an Arthur, a warrior Arthur. I think these early references, and there's only one or two of them, and they're literally one or two sentences, no more. I think they're talking about Hercules. Because when we come up to the 12th century and Monmouth starts talking about King Arthur, the birth and nativity of King Arthur is the same as Hercules. It's the same story. So this early warrior Arthur is being cast as a new Hercules. He is a warrior that comes to the help of armies, when they're in trouble. And it's linked to what we'll be talking about later on, because Hercules is a part of the zodiac. If we look at Hercules and his 12 labors, they are part of the zodiac story. And then when we look at Arthur and his 12 battles, the 12 battles of Arthur, they are a reference to the 12 labors of Hercules. So that is the story of King Arthur for 600 years until we get up to the 12th century. And suddenly, Monmouth starts writing the complete Arthurian story. So having had no information whatsoever about this Arthur character, suddenly, 600 years after he was supposed to have lived, suddenly they find the story. So where did that story come from? How did they find it? Why are we getting more information as we progress through the centuries rather than losing information like we normally do? Where did this story come from? Well, it came from northern France. It came from Brittany. It came from Normandy. It's not a British story. So it came from northern France, and it was spread throughout Germany, Holland, Italy, Spain, Portugal. The one place we don't find a great deal of Arthurian history is in Britain.
Which is odd.
European. Yeah, it is odd, isn't it?
Yeah.
When I first started looking at this, as I say, I hadn't researched Arthurian history. I didn't realize, where this story came from and what it was about. And when I started reading some of the venerable, I prefer to use some of the venerable historians. So the Victorian ones especially, they were very, very good, very knowledgeable people. They had a bit of a Christian bias, which you have to overcome sometimes, but they are very good at actually picking out the minutiae of the history and the subject. They were dedicated to it, not like modern historians who they'll write a book, 150 pages, and they'll say, oh, that's King Arthur. I came across one in my research that was written recently, within the last 2 or 3 years. This guy wrote a complete analysis of Arthurian history without ever mentioning the Vulgate cycle, which is a bit like writing a history of Jesus without ever mentioning the Gospels. I mean, it really was quite crazy. So I tend to use the Victorian historians more than anything else. And the first thing I noticed is the wide spread of Arthurian history. This particular chap I was using, a Victorian historian, I think he mentioned something like 70 different Arthurian manuscripts. And most of them were from France, from Germany, from Spain, from Italy, Greece even. There was a Greek one. Scandinavia, there were several Scandinavian Arthurian histories. And the one area where there was very few indeed, was Britain itself. So we have a European story that suddenly blossomed in the 12th century, the early 12th century. This is about, Geoffrey of Monmouth was about, say, 1125 AD. So what links all of this together? We have a history of a special king, a king who had a tax dispute with Rome, and it's a story that arrived in the 12th century. So what links all of this together? And I think it was fairly obvious from the very start that this has to be something to do with the Crusades. The Crusades started 1196, the First Crusade, and the First Crusade went to Edessa, which, any listeners who have seen my other talks on this subject will know that my last book was called Jesus, King of Edessa, that he was actually a king of Edessa. And the first battle really within the Near East during the First Crusade was at Edessa. So this was Count Baldwin, who was a Norman, of course. He came from Boulogne. He was the Count of Boulogne. And his crusade, he took his contingent. He didn't go down towards Jerusalem. He continued heading east, and he went into Mesopotamia. And the first city that was liberated from Muslim control during the First Crusade was Edessa. And this would have been in about 1200-ish, something of this nature. So any of his courtiers, any of his knights, any contact that he had at that time, anyone traveling back from Syria, would have been traveling back in the early 12th century and would have ended up back in Normandy, somewhere near Boulogne. And I think this is where the first manuscripts arrived from. So this was not a British history. This was a Near Eastern history. This was a Syrian and Judean history that had come back courtesy of the Crusaders and the Templars, who had just arrived back from the First Crusade into Normandy. And yeah, this is where this history came from, because the other odd thing when I sort of started looking into this is that at least, I would say more than half of Arthurian history is actually about Joseph of Arimathea. So the story starts not in Dark Age Britain. It doesn't start with Camelot and King Arthur. Most of these stories start with Joseph of Arimathea. And it really is his story. This is telling his story about what he did in the first century. And surprisingly, he's not exactly the character you think he is. So what we're getting here is an alternative gospel story. This is almost as if this is the fifth gospel of the New Testament, because it's giving us a new perspective on what happened after the crucifixion. Yes, it would be after the crucifixion, because Arthurian history bases this first century story in the AD 70s, not the AD 30s that we're used to for the gospel story and the crucifixion scene, but in the AD 70s. And anyone familiar with my previous works, King Jesus, Jesus King of Edessa, will have realized that I have already set the gospel stories within the AD 70s. And so this is matching very closely with what I've written before, which is why this Arthurian story became, the fourth part of my trilogy, because it's linked, very closely linked, in fact.
Yeah.
So yeah, break in if you want a question at any time as we're passing through this. By the way,
I did think that this work is largely deconstructive. You mentioned that people will raise eyebrows because you're shifting gears so vastly. Whether it would be with Jesus and the tangled tale that you've followed, like a hunter, looking at just a tiny scent on the wind or a footprint that other people wouldn't be able to unpack at all. Same story here. But it will mean you're deconstructing the great mythos. Is this guy, like you said, he's come down to us as an astrological archetype for some of the more esoterically minded people, as you said. He's considered almost a personification of Albion, or Logres, as England used to be called, in some sense, a mythical personification of the land itself, ready to return, the sleeper under the mountain, the sleeper king under the mountain, ready to return at the end of days, like what we have right now with all the invasions and everything. Yeah, it wouldn't be such a bad idea, actually. But he's been this sort of semi-mythical Pendragon, whatever that's supposed to mean, and I know that you unpack that in the book. He was reprised. The whole Arthurian mythos was reprised during the Romantic Victorian era with your Tennysons and your Keats and your Pre-Raphaelites. Skewed, interesting, but you have more of a chivalric model there, and why it was reprised in the Victorian era is another whole subject in itself. And that's where then Hollywood would later pick that image up with your Robert Taylors and then down to more modern times with the bevy of ludicrous renditions that they have in the more the 21st and the late into the 21st century. All of that, the more of that kind of situation, so it's wonderful work, because you're deconstructing a lot of that, which can be unsettling to people, but at the same time, the beautiful thing about this kind of history is that it also can embellish as much as it can deconstruct. It's the same thing you did with Jesus. Once you're putting a face to that, and once you're putting a real rather than a mythic, but you're putting a physical face and a physical history to it, it doesn't actually erase, as people might first think that it does, some of the mythic elements, because those are there behind every individual's life, not just the more heroic, Hegelian heroic types that we're dealing with. So it's up to us to not only take on board the facts, because we need that, these are the rational facts, but it's up to us to also then sort of galvanize, synthesize the mythic elements, and not just completely throw them into the dumpster. So people's fear that, I'll have to throw out all of that magical stuff about Morgane Le Fay and all of that wonderful stuff that I grew up with, as a child. No, there's a time to be a child, and there's a time to have the child mind, and there's a time to see things on an archetypal mythic level. But then there's also a very important, vitally important need to fill in the biographies. And that's what I think your work does. It's kind of a Gestalt approach, and it is deconstructive, but it's extremely needed, because once we also accept, and this is my last point at this point, is that once we do accept only the mythical, like it was the Grail legend, it's all Celtic lore, it's it's mystical, then unfortunately we will obscure, as time goes by, it will obscure us, people like yourself looking at it further afield into its actual origins. And so for you to do this right now, in the 21st century, after all the sort of false trails, as you said, not only these old historians getting it wildly wrong, or even not even mentioning it in the first place, such a monumental character, not even mentioning it, but then all the other mythic stuff, leading up until, the fuzzy Victorian era romantic period, where he's some sort of Don Juan stroke, King Arthur thing. It's really, really miraculous. I mean, I can't just get over the feat of what you've done.
And it was quite a task, because it's a huge subject. I mean, I've got about 20 Arthurian manuscripts here, so each one had to be gone through in detail. So this was 14 hours a day continuous. It just never stopped. I've never seen anything quite so complex. Because it was not only 20 manuscripts, but there were 20 different viewpoints of this same story as well. So you've got to get around that each author had their own viewpoint of this story. They're all using the same story, but they all had different aspects of it that they sort of highlighted, and different characters. So characters like Lancelot, who we all know Lancelot. Lancelot is a very late character. He only comes in at the end of, I think it was Chrétien that created Lancelot. So anywhere before there is no Lancelot, there is no Galahad. So who were they? Well, actually, Lancelot was Ida. And he's a character who comes in some of the early manuscripts, and he just happens to be exactly the same as Lancelot. And Galahad doesn't exist in any of the early manuscripts. And so who was he? Well, he was Percival, actually. And again, they have the same life story. So while looking at the biblical side of this, you've got to also sort out what the Arthurian historians have done with their own story, because they've messed it up as well. Each one used different characters and different names for those characters. So it was, in the beginning of my book, I call it a crossword, because that's what it was. It was trying to link up all of these different names.
And also, it's not just a story of Arthur himself as the stereotype. It's also fused with the Grail. There are almost two characters in one. I know you'll get to that.
Yes.
How that ties in, because it's two stories in one. When you're dealing with the historians you're speaking about, there's a speaking about the physical character, standing on his hind legs, but then you've got this other thing, this weird thing, the history of that on its own, that so many people have tried to cover, whether they've spoken about Arthur or not. There's always these 700-page books out there, I'll mention no names, and there's a big goose egg at the end of it. They're chasing some golden fleece or something along those lines, and they come up, in all of your books, you hit pay dirt. You actually come up with, the solution in all caps. I've read, books that have been $1 million sellers, and they leave you with a big goose egg at the end.
It's true.
and what the hell has my time been just reading this rubbish, or several authors who will take you through another winding labyrinth, like some Monty Python situation, to leave you, in a crevasse, where they say, send, we have no idea what we're talking about, so send it on a postcard, write it down on a postcard if you've got any ideas, and send it over to us. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, you're the one who's meant to be unraveling this bloody mystery, and you're telling us at the end you have no idea who did what to whom and what it's all about. In your works, they're absolutely fantastic, because the meat is there. You actually do pay off at the end. And I'm thinking that, as I said, it's a thing about the Grail, and it's a thing about the physical archetype. So I'm sure you'll talk about that, how that works, how they work together, how they came to be associated.
Yeah, and we do find the Grail in the end, of course, or not physically. I mean, it's still missing, but we know what the Grail is now. So yeah, that's part and parcel of this story. We do find the Grail, all three aspects of it. 4 aspects. It's a multifaceted item, but it is a physical item. It came from out of space. It was brought to Earth by aliens. Well, this is what Arthurian history
said. Are we going to have to rewrite the Indiana Jones movie that was made?
Well, possibly. But it's funny. This is actually what Arthurian history. I'm not making this up. This is what Arthurian history says. It was brought to Earth by aliens, and it was kept by a special royal family. So we'll come on to that later. But yeah, what Michael was saying there, he's highlighting a lot of the essential aspects of this story that, yeah, I am deconstructing this, and that's why people are afraid, because they don't like their mythology and their history being destroyed. But it's not. It is, as Michael said, it's reconstructive, because what I'm showing is these characters did exist. So at present, they're just mythological. We don't know who they are. Who's this Arthur character? No idea. But I'm reconstructing because I'm now giving them real characters behind the mythology. So the Arthur character becomes the Jesus character. The Morgane, the wonderful Morgane, becomes Martha, the sister of Mary Magdalene. So they become real characters. And yes, she was a magician. She was probably schooled by Simon Magus, he's a biblical character. He's in the New Testament. Simon Magus was the primary student of John the Baptist, and he was educated, surprise, surprise, in Alexandria. So we come back that this is an Egyptian story again. So John the Baptist was a tutor and a sage in Alexandria. This comes from the Clementine recognitions. And his primary student was Simon Magus. So if we're looking for a magician within this story, within this first century story, the primary old sage and magician within the New Testament is Simon Magus. So if we're looking for a Merlin character, the Merlin character just has to be Simon Magus. And one of his students, according to Arthurian history, was, of course, Morgane. And I go through a lot of the names here. Morgane, I'm not going to go into this one. It's too difficult to do in a few minutes. Morgane actually refers to Venus. A lot of these are stellar names. But the key thing with looking at these names, and this is one of the big differences I've got with all previous Arthurian researchers, is that these names are Hebrew, Aramaic. Why? Because Arthurian history says they are. I'm not making this up. You know, we have this story, and as I've said in the introduction here, the story came from Syria and Judea. It came back with the Knights Templar after the First Crusade. That's why this history only arrived in northern France in the early 12th century, because it came back with the Knights Templar. So if this story is, as I say, you know, from the Near East, why are people trying to deconstruct, reconstruct, investigate this story by using Welsh? It's not going to work. And we know that this is not a Welsh story because all the way through the Vulgate cycle, it says that all of the names and all of the places, all of the, you know, the recognizable names that we know from Arthurian history are Chaldean. And Chaldean, of course, is Aramaic. So this is an Aramaic story with Aramaic names. And so when we come to, Michael just mentioned there Pendragon, the wonderful, what does Pendragon mean? It means, in Welsh, of course, head of a dragon. But it's not a Welsh story. And when we look at it, actually in the Welsh original manuscript, so this is looking at Brute, well, I call it Brute Oxford. It's in a lot of Arthurian history, it's called Brute Tysilio. It's supposed to be the document written by Tysilio, but the document itself says it was written by Walter Oxford. Again, this is 12th century, so it's quite old. So I call it the Brute Oxford. And it was originally written in Breton. It was then translated into Latin, and then much later it was translated into Welsh. So it's not a Welsh document at all. It's come from Normandy via Latin into Welsh. And if you look at the Welsh, the original Welsh document, which is in the Oxford Library, it's not Pendragon at all. It's not written as Pendragon. I don't know where they got the Pendragon from. It's written as Ben Dragon. It's using the Aramaic the Aramaic Ben, meaning son of. So it was Ben-dragon. And of course, if we now use Chaldean, if we use the Aramaic for the last part of this name, as well as the preceding noun, the dragon within Aramaic doesn't refer. It became the basis of the Greek dragon and obviously the Welsh dragon, but the original Aramaic is fish. It doesn't mean dragon at all. It means fish. So Pendragon actually means son of the fish. But of course, we need to interpret that slightly. Son of the fish, it's not talking about the son of the fish. It's called the son of Pisces. Because all of this story, as we go through this in the next hour or so, we'll see that all of this story was to do with the zodiac, the processional zodiac. And so we're not talking about fish here. We're not talking about fishing. So when Jesus goes on the Sea of Galilee and starts fishing, we're not talking about fish. We're not talking about Jesus as being the fisher of men. We're talking about Pisces. We're talking about the early age of Pisces. And so Pendragon has, in effect, the same title as Jesus. Pendragon means the son of Pisces.
And just to ask a quick question there, Ralph, I know some people watching might be curious about this. As we kind of weave in back and forth from the historical element to the mythical element, how did you navigate that? How did you, like, the way that you just brought that out about Pendragon and then brought it to the fact that they're referencing the son of the fish? Some people might look at that aspect of son of the dragon and stop there and go, oh, it's the son of the dragon court and the bloodlines and that. I mean, that could somehow be maybe more of the historical part. I don't know. But then you decode it further in the original Aramaic and you go, oh no, we're talking about a fish, so then it must be Pisces. How do you as a researcher go about looking at this in both lenses and then somehow put it together? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I got it straight away because I'd already written about this in the King Jesus story. So I'd already written about Jesus being exiled to Chester on the borders of Wales. And this question of Pisces and the dragon had already come up within that book because, the primary symbol of Wales is the dragon, and where did this symbol come from, etc. But then within Arthurian history, we have this mention of a dragon. And I know Aramaic fairly well, so I know what a dragon means in Aramaic. And I know that this is an Aramaic story. And I know the story about, Jonah and the fish. The Jonah and the whale. He was in the belly of the whale for 3 days.
Right.
That this was this fish whale creature, which is called a dagon, of course, the dragon, was not a whale. That this was a story about the diurnal movement of the sun. So in effect, it's an Egyptian story. It's the same as the sun passing through the body of Nut within Egyptian history. A story of the daily cycles of the sun. And yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Well, I was going to say just one little anecdote. Aramaic was that originally a Canaanite language?
Yeah, it's the origins of Hebrew. So Hebrew is the modern version of Aramaic, and Aramaic was the lingua franca of the whole of the Middle East. So everybody, because the Parthian language was very rudimentary, it was not a very good language for doing any literature whatsoever. So everybody over there used Aramaic.
So it would come before the Coptic, before the later Egyptian.
Yes.
Parallel.
After Egyptian. So I think the timeline of these languages is, I believe a lot of these languages came from ancient Egyptian, because the Hebrews, the Israelites, spent 400 years in Egypt. They spoke Egyptian. Joseph, with the coat of many colors, he was the prime minister of Egypt. You don't become the prime minister of Egypt unless you can speak Egyptian. And so the basis for all of these languages was Egyptian. And as it moved up northeastwards into Judea and through into Mesopotamia, it became Aramaic. And then Aramaic branched off, and we get Hebrew, which was obviously, the Israelite language. But then it branched off again, and modern Arabic is a daughter language of Aramaic. It's Aramaic with an Arab accent, as it were.
But where does the Phoenician Canaanite stuff come in? Because the 22 letters of Hebrew can be taken back to the Phoenician Canaanite.
The Phoenician language was again directly from the original Egyptian. So from Aramaic and Phoenician were very, very closely linked. And the difference was that the Phoenicians had the alphabet, and they probably borrowed the alphabet from the Minoans or something like that. So the alphabet came separately. Some people think it came from Egyptian Demotic, which is possible, but I think it probably came from the Minoan scripts, Linear A and B, and that became Phoenician because the Phoenicians were descended from the Minoans.
Sorry, I just didn't want to get you off the thing about talking about the astrology, because that's very important, but I just thought that people might want to know something about the history of the languages, Aramaic and its connection to Egyptian. But yeah, get back to the story about the astrological aspect. That's monumental.
So we have this name Pendragon, which is not Welsh at all. It's Aramaic. It means son of Pisces, and this is interesting in many respects because it gives us this link with the biblical story, because Jesus was born as a Lamb of God within Aries and became a fisher of men, Pisces. And now we have King Arthur being born in Pisces as well, because the birth scene for King Arthur and his sister, who I presume was Guinevere, was that they were born under a comet. And this comet was a comet with two rays, and the one ray was King Arthur and the other ray was his sister, the princess. So it's being described as a comet with two rays, but we've already translated this as being the son not of a comet, not of a dragon, but the son of Pisces. And of course, if you look at Pisces as the symbol of the constellation, it is a symbol with two rays on it. Pisces has two rays coming out with two fish at the end of it. One is Arthur, one is his sister Guinevere. So the symbol of Pisces is the two-ray comet. It wasn't a comet at all. It was the symbol of Pisces that Arthur was born under. So just as Jesus was born under Pisces, he was the first king of Pisces, which is why he became a fisher of men. So King Arthur was also born under Pisces, because his name, the name of his father, was Pendragon, the son of Pisces. So they were both born at the same time, because we can date this as well. This is all to do with processional astrology. And so the constellations move as the millennia move along. And the key element here was the change between Aries and Pisces. Aries was dominant from 1750 BC to about 10 AD. And then the constellations changed to Pisces. And this is why this was such a monumental era, because when we have these changes in the great month, the processional great month, great things were supposed to happen. There is supposed to be a special king is born and special events happen. It's a momentous event. And they did. A special king was born. He was called Jesus Arthur. special things did happen, momentous events did happen. That was the Jewish revolt. And it was probably why the Jewish revolt started, because we had the same, going back into some of my other books, Tempest and Exodus and Eden in Egypt, we had the same at the previous change in the constellations. So the previous one was between Taurus and Aries, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which talks about the change between Taurus and Aries. And if we go back into the Old Testament, the Joseph story, Joseph of the coat of many colors, that story is about the change in the constellations between Taurus and Aries, between the bulls and the rams. And momentous events happened then. We had the Hyksos Exodus, which is the exodus of the shepherd kings. Why were they called shepherd kings? Because this was the age of Aries. And these were the kings who followed the processional great month of Aries. And they had a civil war and a great exodus. And then we come to the 1st century and we have exactly the same happening all over again. So we have a great war, the Jewish revolt, and a great exodus. All the Jews are exiled from Judea, because great events are supposed to happen at the change of the constellations, and great things did happen at the change of the constellations. So the first one resulted in the Israelite Exodus, and that was the Hyksos Exodus, and we know that because Josephus Flavius says so. So Josephus Flavius was the primary historian of Jewish history. He was a 1st century historian, and he says that the Hyksos, the shepherd kings of Egypt, were the Israelites. So we have the direct connection. And then we come to the 1st century, and Jesus does exactly the same. He has a civil war, and all of the Jews they lose the civil war, obviously, and all of the Jews are exiled. So this is a 1st century story, but it is an AD 70s story, not an AD 30s story. There's been a bit of a cover-up here. And this is essential to know this, because the same chasm and the same cover-up happens within Arthurian history as well. So again, this is why this sort of became obvious to me while I was writing King Jesus and Jesus King of Edessa, because we have these parallels all the time between the sort of gospel story and the Arthurian story. I had already noticed this chasm in the record between the AD 30s and the AD 70s, and then we come on to Arthurian history, and it has exactly the same chasm. So this story, as I said in the introduction, is mainly about Joseph of Arimathea. And Joseph of Arimathea is the guy who took Jesus down the cross. Now, that has to be, in Orthodox history, that has to be an AD 30s story, because Jesus is supposed to have died in AD 30. But when you come into Arthurian history, Joseph of Arimathea is a colleague of Emperor Vespasian. It's an AD 70s story. And so we have this chronological chasm again. We've jumped 40 years from the AD 30s to the AD 70s. And it's such a difficult chasm. You can see that this is not real, that all of the authors, Arthurian authors, have to jump this chasm somehow. How are they going to do it? Well, in History of the Holy Grail, what they do is they have Joseph of Arimathea is put in prison. And he goes to prison for 3 days. He wakes up after 3 days, and 40 years have passed. And that's how they overcome the 40-year chasm. So he goes to sleep for 40 years and doesn't realize it's 40 years at all. And he wakes up, and the person who takes him out of the prison is Emperor Vespasian. And funnily enough, if we go to the history of Josephus Flavius, Josephus Flavius does exactly the same. Josephus Flavius is in a dungeon, and the person who comes after 3 days and rescues him from the dungeon is Emperor Vespasian. Same story. Yeah, it's the same story. So we have this parallel story all the way through, and Arthurian history is now giving us this new story, this alternative perspective on the gospel story. And it does something very strange, because Joseph of Arimathea is supposed to be he's the big hero of Christianity, of course. He took Jesus down from the cross. He tended his body and he put him in the tomb, etc. But in Arthurian history, Joseph of Arimathea is the traitor. So it was Joseph of Arimathea who betrayed Jesus and sold him to the Romans. Interesting, isn't it? So
yeah, that is very interesting. I mean, that's almost like a story from Blackadder, the one about going to sleep in the dungeon for 3 days and waking up after 40 years. I mean, there's your history. But yeah, this key point, which again rearranges the dramatis personae, that's fascinating, because again, you know, Joseph of Arimathea is one of these nebulous, ambiguous characters. He's the uncle of Jesus. He's the kingpin of the British Israelite concept of, you know, bringing the young Jesus to England, with all the stuff about the tin mining and all of that palaver that they dredge up. So he's been a character who's flitted, like Merlin, he's flitted in and out of the story, but nobody's ever been able to nail down who this character really is, you know?
Well, from Arthurian history, it seems perfectly obvious that he was Josephus Flavius. So Josephus Flavius was Joseph of Arimathea. And and again, this fits all perfectly, because I'd already said this before, like 5-6 years previously, because if you read Josephus' life, this is Josephus Flavius, if you read his life, which is his autobiography, he says that he, Josephus Flavius, was coming back to Jerusalem after the Jewish revolt, after the revolt had failed. And he saw the 3 leaders of the Jewish revolt being crucified. And of course, the 3 leaders of the Jewish revolt included King Esus. King Esus was the king of Edessa, who actually fomented the Jewish revolt. So one of the 3 who were being crucified was called King Esus. And this character would have worn a crown of thorns, because the crown of Edessa was a crown of thorns. We're getting the same story here. Anyway, so Josephus Flavius comes back, and he's aghast that someone has crucified the leaders, because he knows the political importance of keeping this guy alive. So he petitions the governor of Judea to take them down from the cross. Permission is given. He takes them down from the cross. They are given medical attention. 2 of them die from their wounds, and 1 of them survives. Now, this is a story from real history as we know it. This is what Josephus Flavius actually said in his autobiography. And this is, of course, the biblical crucifixion scene. So we have a historical record of the crucifixion. It's just that this record of the crucifixion happened in AD 70 instead of AD 30. And this, of course, is agreeing perfectly with what Arthurian history is saying, because the Arthurian history is saying exactly the same, that Joseph of Arimathea, who was the guy who, in the biblical story, who took Jesus down from the cross, was an AD 70s character who was a colleague of Emperor Vespasian and worked for Emperor Vespasian, and had been working for the Romans prior to the Jewish revolt. So they are the same person. They just have to be. Josephus Flavius has to be Joseph of Arimathea.
And I guess a lot of scholars never really compared notes with the Arthurian legend and the Gospels and that whole thing. It's you know, do you know of any that have started down that path, or maybe they just didn't make the connections?
Oh, no, I'm sure they did make the connection because the connection is so obvious. Right. The reason they didn't make the connection is because this drags up a whole host of radical problems for Christian history. And anyone who saw this would have dropped it immediately. There's no way they could have run with this particular story. It's too contentious. If you have Joseph of Arimathea being Saul Josephus, it changes the story. Well, it doesn't change it. To me, it doesn't change the Christian story because I've got, sort of broad open mind, and I don't mind if I make a few amendments, as it were, to the story. But for a committed Christian, it means that Jesus was alive in AD 70. He did not die on the cross. So those, and it changes other things as well, but those two main points change the entire biblical history. Oh, it also means that he was a king. So it means that Jesus was crucified in AD 70 after the Jewish revolt. It means that Jesus was not a pacifist. He was actually involved with the Jewish revolt. He was the leader of the Jewish revolt. It means he was a king. And it means that this heroic Joseph of Arimathea fellow was actually the traitor who actually betrayed Jesus, which is exactly what it says in Arthurian history. But all of those points are unacceptable to anyone who follows Christianity, and they're heretical.
And also, wouldn't you say also that they had to drop it because the author who's telling you this is a kind of a harlequin character, that they was so slippery? This is brought out in your work, that the Saul Josephus we're talking about is not only the same as St. Paul, but he's also the harlequin character who inserted himself into Jewish history and basically is the composer of the Talmud. I mean, we're dealing with a hell of a character here, and he alone would have been such a hard person for them to, write into their own narratives, right? Wouldn't you say that?
Absolutely, because he was known as the liar, the traitor. He was everything that Christian history didn't want as its main author of its texts, author of the Gospels, author of, as you say, the Talmud, author of the secular history of Judea, and now also the author of a lot of Arthurian history, because this is what Arthurian history says. So the previous researchers could not have missed this. In fact, I know they didn't miss it because they actually wrote about it. One of the problems with Arthurian history is that the author, the original author of many of these texts, was Josephus Flavius. So we have this strange situation where Joseph of Arimathea is the main character of a lot of these stories. And Joseph of Arimathea has a son, and his son is called Josephus. But this Josephus is often confused with Josephus Flavius. This is what it says in Arthurian history. And it goes to great lengths to say, this is not really Josephus Flavius. This is another Josephus who looks like Josephus Flavius. and this is what it says. And then you have, the Victorian Arthurian researchers who I've been using saying, it does seem peculiar that that the author of this history is said to be Josephus Flavius, because Josephus cannot be writing about a history of King Arthur in the 1st century, when King Arthur is supposed to have been a Dark Ages king. And so they dismiss it. They see it, but they dismiss it because it cannot be. And so they have to dismiss it because the chronology doesn't work if you're using standard Arthurian history. But the chronology does work if you are using the idea that King Arthur was King Jesus. So once you start conflating these two characters, the history does work. It's just that you need to readjust your perceptions slightly. And this is where we're coming into as Michael was saying before, we're reconstructing the story. So it is coming out of mythology and it's arriving back into real history. And it's
So Joseph of Arimathea is Josephus Piso, is that what you're saying, Flavius Josephus?
Yeah, he is his own son in a lot of these texts. You see, we have this Joseph of Arimathea and his son called Josephus, who is Josephus Flavius. However, they are the same character. The son and the father are the same person. And the reason why we have a son and a father is because of this 40-year chasm in the story. What happened was that the Romans created this story, and we'll come on to this in a minute, where we must go on to Sarras and the journey to Sarras. Let me write that down so we don't forget Sarras. The Romans wrote this story, but the Romans didn't want this story connected with the Jewish revolt. They were writing a story about a pauper prince of peace, the biblical Jesus. They didn't want this Jesus character connected with the Jewish revolt, and they especially didn't want him to be the leader of the Jewish revolt, because what Rome wanted was to pacify Judaism, Nazarene Judaism. This is not Orthodox Judaism, this is Nazarene Judaism. Jesus was a Nazarene. Saul was also a Nazarene, as it says in Acts very clearly. And the Nazarene were a sort of Egypto-Judaic sect, which was more to do with the zodiac and procession than it was to do with Orthodox Judaism as we know it. And we'll come on more to do with this zodiac business in a minute, because it's the central element of Nazarene Judaism and Arthurian history is the zodiac. But the Romans wanted to distance their new hero character from the events of the Jewish revolt. And so what they did, and it was very clever, it was Josephus that did this, of course, because he wrote a lot of these texts. He just took that story and he threw it back in the past by 40 years. And made it an AD 30s story. So he separated it physically, chronologically, from the Jewish revolt. But in doing so, he's completely messed the whole story up, because anyone who is connected with Jesus, Saul, or Joseph of Arimathea has a 40-year chasm in their story. And that chasm has to be overcome somehow. And so the two routes that they took in History of the Holy Grail was they made Joseph of Arimathea go to sleep for 40 years. That overcame the story. But then they had another problem with who was writing this story. And so they gave him a son who was his own self to bridge the 40-year gap. And so the son called Josephus is actually Josephus of Arimathea himself. And that's one of the key problems you have to overcome in any of this research, is overcoming this chronological chasm, as I call it, because it appears everywhere. It appears in the New Testament, it appears in Acts, it's in the historical record continually. If you read Josephus's Jewish War and his Antiquities, you're continuously coming across this duplication of the record, because it has this 40-year chasm in it, and of course it appears all the time within Arthurian history as well. So yeah, this is an AD 70s story about the Jewish revolt. And you'll note here, we're not actually talking very much about King Arthur. You see how different this story is from the classical image of King Arthur and Camelot and Galahad and Percival. So we'll come on to Percival now, and we'll find that we're still in the 1st century, because if you read things like Parsifal, which is written by Wolfram von Eschenbach. Wolfram writes one of the best manuscripts for Arthurian history. So where does he start his story? Well, he starts it in Syria, of course. So the father of Percival, who is Galahad, was a king of Mesopotamia. He was a king of Babylon. And you think, hold on a minute, where's this Arthurian history going from? But that's where he starts his story. He starts it in Babylon.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and then he has to try and bring his story back to France later on in order to make it into a Norman French story. But yeah, it starts in Babylon. And History of the Grail does exactly the same thing. So we're still talking about Joseph of Arimathea here. And this is after the... Right, so let's set the picture. The picture is AD 70, after the Jewish revolt. Vespasian now is emperor. He was the commander who won the Jewish revolt. He is now the emperor of Rome. And Vespasian sends Joseph of Arimathea to Sarras. And this is a central component within Arthurian history. And nobody knows what this actually means and where this place is. But Sarras was on the way to Babylon. So it was halfway to Babylon. So it's pretty obvious that Sarras is actually Palmyra, where they're fighting right now, where ISIS is holed up and ISIS is blowing up all of the temples there, most unfortunately. So Sarras is Palmyra. Why is Joseph of Arimathea being sent there? Because Vespasian sent him there to take the surrender of the Palmyrans, because the Palmyrans were a central component in the Jewish revolt. The Jewish revolt was organized by the kings of Edessa in northern Syria, and one of their capital cities, probably the richest city they had, was Palmyra. So Joseph of Arimathea was sent by Vespasian to take the surrender of the Palmyrans and also to change their religion as well. So we have this wonderful story of Joseph of Arimathea going off to Palmyra, which is called Sarras. And nobody knows what Sarras means. But we have to compare two stories here. Arthurian history is nothing if it is not confusing, because Arthurian history has its own chronological chasm within itself. Because King Arthur is supposed to be a Dark Age king. So within Arthurian history, there is a 500-year chasm within Arthurian history as well. So we have two chasms here. And so we have two Sir Galahads. We have a 1st century Galahad who ended up in Sarras, Palmyra, and we have a 5th century Sir Galahad who ended up as the King of Wales. And Galahad, by the way, was the son of either Lancelot or he was the son of Joseph of Arimathea. So Joseph of Arimathea had a son called Galahad. Confusing? It will be.
No kidding. But now that you're talking about it, though, it all starts to make sense. But you do have to take into consideration this idea, like you said, that this is layers of multiple stories and timelines intertwining together. And I think a lot of historians just skip over and they'll pick a side on it. Whereas when you really dissect it and try to unfold it, now it becomes complicated. And the regular person doesn't want a complicated story. They want something simple that they can digest easily and they can be done with it, which is why it's worked for so long. When the truth, actually, you have to be like a detective in your approach, and you really have to dissect it and try to pick it apart in order to get all these different elements. So confuse us away, Ralph, because I think it's valuable.
Yeah, well, you've just got to understand what these people were trying to do.